This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Psst, healthcare pros, word's out, and it's too good to keep quiet. Look, LinkedIn is revolutionizing job hunting, making it possible to search by specialty, shift preference, and salary. Endless scrolling is out. Whether it's a mental health therapist or dental hygienist, finding the perfect role is faster and easier than ever. Head to linkedin.com/healthcare and start your search today.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the Dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
For a limited time at McDonald's, get a Big Mac Extra Value Meal for $8. That means 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, and medium fries, and a drink. We may need to change that jingle.
Prices and participation may vary.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week, we're taking a weird and wild ride through the 2D roguelike action horror slasher Hotel Barcelona from White Owls Inc. and legendary off-kilter developers Suda51 and Swery. We meet Federal Marshal Justine, who finds herself investigating the luxurious grounds of none other than Hotel Barcelona, a haven for America's deadliest serial killers that need to be put down for good. Justine just so happens to share her consciousness with imprisoned serial killer Dr. Carnival, who empowers her with the ability to change into Bernstein, her superpowered killing machine alter ego, as they both hunt the witch who's running the show at Hotel Barcelona. And lastly, we were provided codes by Hotel Barcelona PR for the purpose of our review. So Hotel Barcelona is a collaboration, as I noted, between developer Suda51 and Swery. Suda51 being behind games such as No More Heroes, Killer 7, which we're still going to find time at some point in the future to chat about. And the later being the developer behind games such as Deadly Premonition and Good Life. And while both of those names being mentioned mean something for people like us and other hardcore fans of games that have obviously experienced their very unique sort of approach to game design. For those that are unfamiliar with them, Neil, how would you sort of generally characterize their approach to game development, and in the process, naming maybe a few of their works that you've enjoyed in the past for various reasons?
Sort of straight away to sort of mention a game in particular that came into mind for this one was Swery's The Missing, J.J. Macfield, and The Island of Memories, which is a 2D game as well, which is a bit different in how it's depicted. It's it's more of a puzzle platformer at first than a sort of action game. But it's a general sort of sense of horror in the surreal, as much as it is the actual having blood and violence and stuff like that. It's certainly you can see influences from cult cinema is in both works there. Yeah, to be honest, that's the main thing. They have a good relationship with the horror genre that isn't just your typical sort of stuff. And they really do both lean into that sort of surreal stuff there. But yeah, this for me was the most a Swery game, in terms of that sort of style, and some of the weird bits. But I suppose when we do get into it, it's as a union, it sometimes feels like they cancel each other out a bit.
Yeah, I suppose that's the point in which we should mention that, this was, from my understanding, really the idea for Hotel Barcelona was sort of the brainchild of Suda51. And then Swery is, sort of the director that's leading the charge with this game in terms of its development. So, yeah, I think that for me, what I've always appreciated about these two developers' approach to game design is the fact that it's always weird, very off kilter. But at the same time, like in the past, there's always been an approach to gameplay that was a really solid foundation. And it's something that we talk about a lot because you and I have very similar interests in games, whereas, we're really here for like the weird stuff. I love playing, the sort of routine approach to whatever the genre or subgenre is at times. But at the same time, like we really enjoy games that go out of their way to provide an experience, whether it's in terms of gameplay, whether it's story, whether it's presentation, like games that go out of their way to present those different sort of like inherent strengths of the medium in ways that are untraditional. And like these two developers, I think, are two of the best examples of that. So for as weird as their worlds are, there's always been, for the most part, like gameplay that's backed up that weirdness in a way that it's like, oh, there's more to this than just, hey, look at this weird shit that I've done, which I think previously you and I have talked about some games that once you actually get around to playing them, it's like, oh, all this has is the fact that it goes out of its way to be weird, but it might not actually be all that fun to actually experience. And I think for me, like with Hotel Barcelona, I agree to the degree that it's the type of game where it's like I can appreciate the fact that it is a hodgepodge of a lot of various different influences, whether that be tonal influence, whether that be gameplay influence. But at the same time, it does feel like this sort of like amalgamation of the two halves of this creative coin that don't always sort of like coalesce with one another in the way that I would really want. I think that if we're going to just start off and talking about it, like the sort of like narrative of this game, I think more or less works for me because of the fact that that is the really kind of just like weird aspect of this game. Like first and foremost, this is clearly a game that's being made by two people that have a great love of the horror genre, right? Through and through. And we'll talk about it later on. This has a heavy sort of influence of a love for horror films and having those play out in the world and the influences that are there. But I guess like for you, what was kind of your first impression overall of Hotel Barcelona?
I think its upfront presentation is the good hook for this game, in terms of like, where it be the cutscenes that are limited as they are in the game. It's like they're nicely drawn, impressive stuff. A good sort of opening bit to the game as well. And yeah, just a general sort of hook of what's going on in a story as well. This the idea of just being someone who's possessed effectively by a serial killer and then taking on other serial killers. It's got, considering the kind of game it is, which is very hack and slash, it does just feel like the plot of a hack and slash game straight away. So that's perfectly fine and over the top with it. I think, so as an initial impression, I think it does a good job. I think the game itself doesn't make a great impression to begin with, especially. For reasons we will definitely get into as we talk more about the game. But when you have these sort of side-scrolly sort of platforming action games, so if you wanted like a relative example, you're talking like a Metroidvania style game, like Dead Cells or something like that, but far more straightforward. There are branching paths you can take on each run, and obviously you can build up your abilities like a roguelike and learn from it like that. But the key for games like that, especially the really good ones, is that even in the early going, you feel a kind of fluidity to the movement and to the combat that is then built upon as you learn abilities, as you learn how the game plays. I think Hotel Barcelona is like from the off very if you were to side with one developer over the other, this feels very much more like it was made by the guy who made Deadly Premonition than the guy who made Killer 7. Like in terms of like the fluid nature. I mean, neither is really been for like traditional gameplay stuff in terms of how things handle. So this feeling like a more straightforward game in terms of how it is presented, what you can do in the levels. it is a bit underwhelming that there wasn't refinement in that regard, and certainly balancing that, I think. So yeah, as a first impression, as a game, not great, but I do think you start to get into its groove a little bit more as time goes on. Still problems, but I think you at least kind of find a comfort level, and you can find a way to sort of work within the parameters of the game to sort of get on with it.
Yeah, I'll say this, like, it's the type of game that I understand, I suppose, the direction that they took in terms of like the game opens and there is quite literally zero hand holding in that opening. You are quite literally dropped into that first level after a brief bit of, I suppose it's just like preamble dialogue, which I don't even remember much of what it says, but it kind of just like is set dressing essentially. It doesn't really actually prepare you from a standard approach to like, this is the plot of the game. This is the mechanics of the game. You're kind of like just dropped into that first level, which even for somebody like myself and certainly you, like, we're people that are familiar with games like Dead Cells. We're familiar with Metroidvanias and roguelites, but even those games still had like some semblance of kind of like adequate preamble. And in this, it's just so blunt and so sudden that it is disconcerting even for us, which I don't necessarily think is like actually a positive here. I think that even if we're familiar with it, like we should still get a sense of some kind of like a primer that is more than what is given here. Because it feels a little aimless, right? And obviously that's to facilitate the notion that in Hotel Barcelona, like death is a pretty integral part of the experience. And I guess for more casual players, they need that lesson early on, right? That death is going to not only be commonplace, but it's to be celebrated specifically for this game because of one of the features, which we'll chat about more. But I don't know, it was one of those things where it's like, I don't feel like I need an overabundance of hand holding because again, like the gameplay is not overly complicated outside of maybe one or two aspects of it. So I don't think it really necessarily made a great first impression of me because I was kind of just like taken aback by how you're introduced to the world and whatnot. But I think that once you get a handle on like what you're doing in this game and some of more of the sort of like parameters of the world, you ease into it a little bit, but that is not without, maybe a new cropping of faults that you could find with it at times, even if, some people might find a good groove with this game, I suppose. But I definitely gravitated towards the weirdness of it right from the jump. Kind of felt like Dead Cells by way of Silence of the Lambs, by way of like a Takashi Miike film, in terms of like the violence, having the relationship between Justine and Dr. Carnival, which is like this fucking hilarious relationship between like just so completely insane, as if, Hannibal Lecter is inside Clarice's head. They've got this like psychic link kind of, but it was just one of those types of narratives that I think I really gravitated towards, even if maybe later on that reveals an aspect of this game that is a little grating after a couple of hours. But I guess for you, like, what did you think of sort of the premise and the setup for, yet another action slasher roguelite?
Well, yeah, I mean, the slasher thing is the important thing about this for me in terms of like giving it a sense of identity. It's like as much as they are at war in terms of trying to find one person to have their voice, I think what can't be denied is like, what the influence point is and how much of a celebration it is of that. Like that, it's very in your face with like, the slasher stuff and in terms of like the bosses and like the first boss is a riff on Jason, obviously, that is called Jacob, who is infatuated with baseball instead, which is fine. And they all kind of go on that sort of line. It's like, the Leatherface type is a weird like chimera masked guy who sounds like a French chef going cock-a-doodle-doo, and you have an alien riff that is also partly a species riff, which is quite interesting, and in terms of like deep cuts, in terms of like that, like where they don't just do slashers, like they go for stuff like that. That was quite interesting because it would have been very boring if it was just all slasher stuff and the very obvious things, and because some of them would just feel too samey, if they'd just gone with certain ones. So yeah, I quite liked the selection they went with on that as well. Yeah, that they and the levels tend to sort of represent those characters quite well. And obviously, the hotel itself, the lobbies, the Shining lobby, and things like that, and the bartender is Mr. Grady, and like it's they're not hiding those influences in the slightest like that, but that's kind of fun. I mean, I definitely seen people saying, so they dislike how obvious it is, in terms of like the references, and so not everything has to be cute and clever.
Right.
Like sometimes it's just nice to like, they like horror, and they're like, these things are all here, and that's fine. And it makes the idea of a protagonist who is infused with the soul of the killer and goes around chopping killers up is fun. Like it makes sense for the story. It works, in terms of like as a hook. The idea of like this inner battle thing, which has been done plenty of times, but having a literal serial in your head rather than just like it's a side of you sort of thing. It is even that's a good riff on some of the stuff these guys have done in the past.
Yeah, I would say for me, like as well, I don't think that they need to be super clever with how blatant, obviously, their influences are, right? And if anything, that kind of adds to what I would say is like the charm of these two developers' games in the past, right? Is that they've never shied away from their influences, really. Maybe here it's a little more blatant, but I think that the fact that they go to the lengths that they do to make the love of horror games be apparent and to be reflective of not only the worlds, but also the enemies, most certainly the boss designs. But this is also one of the aspects that I think is quite strong for Hotel Barcelona, which overall is like the presentation value, especially with the introduction of those bosses. You have these mini sort of, I almost don't know what you would call them. They're kind of like these strange like FMV sections or trailers that kind of like take this hodgepodge of stylistic sort of like images, and then you've got these crazy visuals that go along them, and they're almost like sort of like this like acid sort of mentality behind them, where you've got this kind of like, I don't even know, like how would you describe them? Because for me, like the introduction of those videos felt like rips of VHS tapes and videos and stuff from like the 90s and early 2000s, and there's just kind of this whole like, I don't know, this like grungy feel to everything with the way it's presented in that regard.
Yeah, it's kind of like Creep Show meets Trauma sort of styling.
Oh, sure,
Like that very grungy lo-fi stuff that's got a style to it, at the very least. Down to the cover art, which does feel very like Creep Show-esque, meets like Dario Argento sort of cover art stuff. And it's going for a very European feel in a lot of ways, maybe, and like, which considering I've mentioned American companies, they would maybe seem a bit odd, but I think it's that sensibility of like indie sort of, not your mainstream stuff, which is given the people involved, makes total sense. They don't tend to, even here, embracing a lot of mainstream characters are still sort of like depicting it in a way that sometimes comes across in a stylish way that you wouldn't associate it with those. So I mean, it is a cool art style, I think, when it does crop up like that, at least.
Yeah, I think for me, like as much as I liked it, I wish there was a little bit more of it. But I think at the same time, like early on, you get this first look at the game's animation style, right? Because outside of those little brief moments that I mentioned, you have early on like the backstory of Justine, how she arrived at Hotel Barcelona, and there's this really fantastic anime cutscene sequence that you get. And while, the contents of that in terms of like dialogue maybe is up for debate about how much quality there is there. I think that like the actual animation itself is quite good. And again, it kind of like elicits this blending of like this acid washed like 60s to 80s kind of like influence and presentation and whatnot that is like outlandish, but still there's some artistic integrity there. It really does utilize like a really great color palette that's quite loud. And I think that overall, like it even extends to when you're in the hotel and you're having these bits of interactions with characters and the dialogue with them, you get these fantastic art portraits of the characters. And yeah, I think for me, like the presentation of Hotel Barcelona is quite strong. And overall, like I think that to have an art style and sort of a general production value that kind of like supports that in a way really helps to sell the world of it more so than if maybe those aspects of its presentation kind of just like felt a bit like an afterthought, perhaps.
Yeah, I think the game is best looking outside of the game. If you know what I mean, it's like the actual playing, if you will, in level to level. The presentation is a bit more slapdash and a bit more ordinary, I suppose. But I do think like the outward presentation, of those cutscene things, of those characters, sort of visual novel style screen, text screens between them. Interesting delivery system for this, but yeah, at least the character art looks interesting. And yeah, it's I suppose it's one of the problems with the game in general is that, like, for every time it does something good, there's a lot of examples of it not working as well, where it just kind of frustrates you. It's like, but then again, it's like I think of the games, especially Swery, where it's like you look at them and go, yeah, that for that reason would feel much like that kind of game, because he's renowned for those kind of games where it's like presentation's not up to much. There's charm and it's weird. There's nothing quite like it, sort of thing. And so you kind of accept that. I think here, because you've got two people trying to sort of collaborate like this, it's kind of like when you think of collaborations in the horror space where they don't always work. Creepshow is an interesting, because obviously that was George Romero and Stephen King, and like it worked the first time, and then it didn't work quite as well the second time. And like when George Romero and Dario Argento worked together on doing Edgar Allan Poe stories, it's like, it kind of works, but it also like you've got to have a unifying feel to it, which you don't quite get, because someone's got to win out. Someone's personality is going to gain dominance, and if not, you end up with something that's maybe going to have both of your weaknesses. And like that's the problem I think the game has, is that it's taken on too many of the weaknesses of both, and not enough of the strengths.
Yeah, I suppose that kind of like brings me to one of my initial issues with this game, which is like, and I alluded to it, I think, briefly earlier, where like, I don't know, like the humor of this game doesn't really work for me in a way that it doesn't feel like it's super prevalent, but every time it comes up, it kind of just is like, I don't know, it feels a little try hard, or it feels like it's venturing into the camp of like, you can't say anything these days, otherwise you get canceled. Like there's this kind of like tone of that out there, which I think that's it pretty evident from like the very first, that animated cutscene, which I think looked quite good. But like, there's this whole talk about like what you can say or can't say, or what's discriminatory or what isn't. Like at one point, Justine is transporting basically a vigilante to Hotel Barcelona who is supposed to go there to like kill all the serial killers. And he keeps referring to her as like a black cat, I think. And she happens to be black, like instances like that. And then he kind of like defends his use of it. And there's a couple other instances of sort of just like, I don't know, dialogue that is indicative of just this like kind of like weird vibe. And obviously none of it is very funny, and it's not overbearing, but it is frequently enough that I think it's even worth mentioning. To be honest, how did you kind of feel about, maybe did you pick up on some of those aspects of the dialogue or character personas?
Yeah, see, in many of those cases, like I get where they're coming from, like with the jokes, like in that intro of like with that particular suave sort of hero to be, like, and the fact that he just gets, spoiler, like, killed off very quickly, and in a sort of very unceremonious fashion. It's a good sort of swerve into the story as a joke, to say that, so we're not going to be playing that guy. So, you're playing as, this person who seems meek and mild, but, has a killer inside them. And even like the cancel culture joke thing, in that sense of, like, in a game where you are just like hacking things to pieces and you've got a serial killer in your brain, like that is, you can kind of see the funny side of that. But again, it's about the execution of that joke, like, where it doesn't, it should be really easy to make that joke and it not be too tired sounding. But I think, I heard actually this just in a sort of reference point, like, about Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another, where, like, it's the idea of, like, respecting young characters as an older person and not treating them like back in my day sort of thing, and, like, making fun of the way kids are now and stuff like that, and actually having respect for some people of a younger age. This is a game that's like the opposite of that, where you have two older men very much like doing it as a joke, but not like that sort of thing, and it doesn't quite work, and it just feels like you're kind of demeaning the point of what you're going for.
I this is the thing, like, I don't think that it necessarily kind of has a huge negative impact on my overall feelings of the game. Like, I'm going to get into, after our break, some aspects of this game that I think are a much larger issue, perhaps. But it definitely is notable in a way that it's like, I like the premise. I like Justine and her relationship with Dr. Carnival. It's just the type of thing where it's like, every time you have a new character interaction, I kind of was just like waiting to roll my eyes after a certain point, because I was like, how corny or how cheesy is this going to get? Or how just like, how much of a missed opportunity is this going to be, perhaps? So that's why I brought it up mostly, because I think that, it doesn't end up bringing things to a screeching halt, but it definitely gave me pause more than a few times. It's just like, all right, that's the joke we're going for. Or, this is, the type of character this is going to be, type of a thing. But I guess, anyways, we can take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll chat a little bit more about the level design, and we'll get really into like the nitty gritty of Hotel Barcelona, which is its approach to an action slasher roguelite, and sort of like gameplay and how combat landed for us. Cause there's some interesting mechanics there, but I can't say for me that each one of them really sort of like worked and coalesced into as seamless of a combat experience as I would have really liked. But we'll have more on that in a moment.
Experience a membership that backs your business journey with American Express Business Platinum. When you pay with membership rewards points for all or part of an eligible flight booked with a qualifying airline through Amex Travel, you can get 35% of those points back, up to 1 million points back per calendar year. American Express Business Platinum. There's nothing like it. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Xyzal is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Xyzal keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Xyzal. At night.
Don't chew on that, Max.
Cooper loves that chew, too.
Oh, now he's into Cooper's food. Wow, he is loving it. What do you feed Cooper?
Blue Buffalo Life Protection Formula. He never leaves a crumb. I love it because it's made with high-quality protein, nutrient-rich fruits and veggies, and wholesome whole grains.
Looks like we're switching to Blue.
Blue Buffalo foods are made with the superior ingredients your dog needs to thrive. Can your dog food say that? Visit feedbluefood.com to learn more.
And we're back from our break. And as we've been talking about, there's a pretty heavy horror film influence here, that playing out both in terms of the bosses adopting some identities. As we've already mentioned, there's a pretty heavy-handed approach to a love for Jason Voorhees with that first opening zone. And, that's not a negative in describing it that way because of the fact that, they take that love of horror and they really do flesh it out into more than just the boss. You've got the setting, you've got the enemies that you are going to encounter in terms of like the goons or the grunt level enemies. But also like there's still that general weirdness there that I think we've now established with these two creatives. It's like, not only is this basically like the Jason Voorhees campsite, but also you're going to be fighting, basically like mini rabbits that have explosive dynamite on their chest. I guess all dynamite's explosive. They've got dynamite vests that they wear, and they'll kind of like try to sabotage themselves and blow up in your face and things like that. So like, even for those influences, at the same time, there still is this like weird, but at the same time, creative spin on things that doesn't sort of just rest on the laurels, I suppose, of those influences. And for me, I really appreciated, I think overall, just how each one of the 7 zones fully embraces those influences, both in the environments, in the enemy types, and then as we were saying before the break, like that approach to the presentation of not only the world, but I think also in the various cutscenes and sort of like cinematic moments in this game.
Yeah, I mean, like you were saying about the enemy things, like while like most of them are fairly generic, I think when you do get certain ones that fit the levels, I do find them very interesting. Like the second levels has a restaurant style theme to it, and in crates that you smash open, little killer tomatoes come out, like stuff like that. And it's a really cool small way of like referencing something like that and having it fit a level. And there are great instances of that, like level to level stuff that isn't necessarily like straight off the franchise that you're expecting, but fits that tone. Like the sort of hillbilly types in the Jason and Jacob level, and that. But there are occasions where they don't really fit, and you just sort of get stuff just carry over, and I don't see the point of view. And I don't know, there's a few enemies where you're just like, I don't see the point of view at all. But I think it's not a terrible selection. I just don't think they're all drawn equally, if you know what I mean. That just there's some really good designs, good ideas, and then there's stuff that just kind of feels like, well, we had to add more, and they were what we got, sort of thing. Like the alien level has those like face hugger-esque things that they just look like really basic art, of like these little spider monsters, and just considering how sort of much of them there are in the level, they don't feel fun or as a design, and don't really feel like, I know you can't obviously do a one thing, but they could have been better animated maybe, or just looked better, because they just look like a little mix of triangles, and that's it.
Yeah, I think for me, like I definitely appreciate the art direction and the changes in that go with each stage and each enemy that's found within that stage. I suppose I don't have as much of an issue with like the art design and the style there for each of them. What I more have an issue with, and this kind of like brings me to my big issue with the game, is a majority of the enemies that you fight in this game outside of the bosses, I don't necessarily think like they provide much challenge outside of what you would generally associate with combat. So like for the most part, each time I fight an enemy, I have the same exact strategy for each of them, other than occasionally you'll come across like a massive, like extra large version of an enemy, right? And then it's like, okay, I have to be aware of their basically like strike range for whatever attack they have, and the fact that they have 5 times the amount of health that their smaller counterparts do. But I didn't necessarily feel like enemies had any real sense of identity outside of a different skin, essentially, that they wear. Which I think overall like is a pretty massive issue for a game that is a roguelite. And we might use games such as Dead Cells as an example of like, hey, this is kind of similar to this, but like the best roguelites and especially Metroidvania games, like each enemy that you fight, it might look different, but at the same time, you recognize the importance of their combat pattern and what skills you need to use to combat them. I found that for me, like I basically use the same strategy for 90% of encounters. Any enemy that has their feet on the ground, I'm either juggling them or I'm doing like the low sort of like spin kick move or slide kick move, because it makes them stumble for half a second, then they can't hit you. If it's one of these sort of like, I think they're like basically hornet mobs that hover in the air, I'm going to jump in the air once and use my ranged weapon, and that's the end of them. Like there's not a whole lot of strategy that I think you actually need to use in the room to room encounters. Now that goes out the window when you talk about bosses, but for me, like I think a big detriment overall to Hotel Barcelona is the general enemies and the lack of sort of like finesse that you need to deal with them. There's no real like, oh, I need to use this strategy or that strategy. And even aspects outside of direct attacks, such as like blocking or parrying, like those don't feel nearly as mandatory as features such as that should be. I think that's twofold in that they don't feel terribly effective. And at the same time, the gameplay in general, I think, is a little sluggish for what needs to be this like very tight sort of approach to like the player needs to be ensuring that every single strike they do is perfectly coordinated, perfectly timed. Otherwise, it could mean death. And in this, it feels more like a button masher for me, rather than this thing that really requires a lot of pristine attention to like timing.
Yeah, it comes down to the fact that, because of the clunkiness of a lot of what's in here, you basically go for the quickest moves, the stuff that's easy, quick to do, responsive, which, is a very small pool of moves, as you've pointed out. And so, you can't help but sort of end up going that way. Because, like, talk, for instance, about ranged weapons, like, the pistols are shit, for example. Like, but there's the basic thing. But, yeah, for like, some enemies, they're fine. They'll do the job. The shotgun is even worse. Like, the time it takes for it to actually fire and the spread, it's just poor. We've talked about this for plenty of games before, but you need oomph with your weaponry if you're going to have like that. And none of the weapons have any oomph at all. Like that, there's just no weight to combat in the way that it should be. The weightiest thing appears to be you, and that's not fun. Like that. You want to, considering you're supposed to be like basically like super powered effectively, you just don't feel as slick as you should like that. And that's such a big thing, in a game like this. And so it all comes down to balance. And the proper problem there is, we've just mentioned all these things that don't work on that regard. As a general overall balance as well, it's just so messy. Like, to start with, it's like I'm getting hit all the time and it's not my fault because, you don't know what's like going to work for you. And then, of course, you fall that pattern of using the same few moves. It doesn't quite work with the bosses as well. So you end up like it is. And one of the best features of the game is like basically the phantom thing where ghosts of your previous runs will like turn up and play with you, as long as you go along the same path. But for a boss fight, that's great because then you can have 2 or 3 like helpers and really knock their health bar down and maybe give yourself a better chance. But when that starts happening, it massively overpowers. Like if you go in the same way, because bosses that before you were struggling with that, now suddenly it's like, well, piece of piss. It was dead in 2 seconds, and it's like, And obviously, as you go through runs and you can sort of loop and you keep your abilities and you get powered up, and at that point, like none of it's doing anything. Like you're just going through enemies, and the only reason you get hit is because you're just being lackadaisical and careless because it doesn't feel like a threat or a challenge. And then you get the bosses, and same, you can just sit there, take a few, destroy them like that. It's that was And I think then you try and ramp up your difficulty to try and make it maybe feel like more of a challenge, but it doesn't. Like that, so it's either wildly unfair, or just cheap and doesn't really work for me. At a certain point, the game just starts being too samey, and just offers no challenge whatsoever unless you really ramp it up to a point where it's just unpleasant to play because the games have problems, which you need all the combat abilities for higher difficulty levels, but they don't work very easily on lower difficulty. You go to higher ones, Christ, you got a real problem. You have to be really good at sort of chaining these things together.
Yeah, I think that this is my biggest issue with the game. And, earlier you mentioned talking about the two, Suda 51 and Swiri, their influences and whatnot actually kind of like contrasting against one another or not always working well with one another. I mean, you mentioned the phantoms in this game, which is like the slasher phantom, which is arguably one of the most unique aspects to the approach here with, a roguelite action slasher, in that, you get to basically watch a phantom much as you can in, like racing games. You race basically a phantom car of your last run to kind of like beat your own score or whatnot. That's the same notion behind the slasher phantoms here. And, it having more of an impact on gameplay, I think first and foremost is great. I think that's a cool idea. I think that it helps, especially in a game, as you mentioned, like this, that is fucking difficult as hell as soon as you start it, right? Even on easy, bosses can be a handful, which I found more than a few times in trying to get through a couple of stages here. But like, all that to be said, the slasher phantom is great until you realize that they only support you through the rooms. As we mentioned, like each of the levels is broken up by basically like rooms. And every time you enter a room, it gives you a different sort of pathway that your player can choose to getting to the boss. There's like, 8 or 9 rooms per zone. And that basically gives you replayability because of how enemies will spawn in new places, and you get different buffs from going in different rooms and so forth. Except the slasher phantoms only follow you when you're doing a path that you've already done before, which ultimately, like, that makes it more difficult and in a sense, like, punishes the player for trying something new. Going a new route means that, I'm going to lose all of that help from the slasher phantoms, which certainly the case on, I'm comfortable saying, any difficulty. You have to have 3 or 4 slasher phantoms to get through some of these bosses. Now, maybe some people are much better at this game than I am, which is not saying much considering how shit I was at this game. But at the end of the day, like, I found that the slasher phantoms were the thing that allowed me to get through, 4 or 5 zones of this in the amount of time that I had to play it. So the notion of not having those because I'm not experimenting, which you would want the game to actually promote, is like kind of just a chin scratcher at the end of the day for me.
Yeah, that's it. I know there's a co-op mode as well, so which replicates that, but the same problems would surely persist there, like that. So being pre-released didn't get a chance to really do that, so that was an issue. But yeah, I don't really see how that would change many of the problems, apart from that age-old thing of like playing with friends on a bad game makes a bad game better, sort of thing. But yeah, it's still a bad game, like that, which we don't like to say very often, especially when the concept is as interesting as this one has. But yeah, it is just a bad game, like in terms of like, not awful, not terrible, but just like, in terms of what kind of game it's trying to be, it's not hitting any of those notes. And even like in the horror stuff, there's some cool fun bits and surreal moments, but for the levels of the people involved, it's really not there like that. So yeah, it's just not doing any of the things you'd hope it would do well.
Yeah, and I think for a genre that's so well established, such as, the Metroidvania roguelite, it is pretty confusing why it seems that Hotel Barcelona is not able to nail certain aspects of it that you would think are quite simplistic, which leads me to my other biggest issue with this game that you already talked about, which is that combat is completely unsatisfying. There's absolutely no oomph to any weapon that you use. First and foremost, we have to lead with the heavy attack in this game for any weapon has an absolutely comical amount of like build up to it. Like if you're going to use a heavy attack in this, you need to like prepare yourself for 3 to 4 business days before it connects, because like even with something I think about our time with games like Bloodborne and Soulsborne games, like I understand that you really have to, timing is everything, but here it is so comical that you need to lead into a heavy attack when an enemy is a good 5 or 6 paces away from you, and wait for them to come into your vicinity like that is just like, it's cartoonish to the degree that I stopped using heavy attacks about 90 minutes into the game, because it's just for a game where even the most simplistic of enemies can drop 70% of your health in a hit and a half. Like, it's too much risk, on top of the fact that I found that the block and parrying features in this were so unreliable, both in terms of the timing that's required, but also like a couple of times they just straight up, I feel like, were unresponsive in a way that is unacceptable basically for a game such as this, I think.
Yeah. It again goes back to what we're saying, that you end up with such a small pool of things you want to do, because so many of the abilities are just not worth it. Like parrying, I just gave up on parrying very quickly. Like, I just didn't use it. Like, I probably made it harder in certain aspects, but yeah, like I said, once you get to the point where it becomes absurdly easy, honestly, you can just breeze through it. Like, and I said, the only reason you get damaged badly is because eventually you just, mainly because the game doesn't really offer you many chances to heal. That's the only reason you end up dying anyway.
Oh, I mean, for me, like anytime I came to the decision of like which door am I going to go through to the next zone, 95% of the time I just chose the one that gives me a health buff, because otherwise there's no way to do it. So like right off the bat, the developers have invalidated the 3 or 4 other types of ways to, boost your character. And on top of that, the weakness just in general of weapons means that progression doesn't feel really notable. I mean, I probably put 7 or 8 hours into this. I don't feel like any of my weapons, outside of the 1 or 2 instances when I went to what is called the casino, where you basically get the free chance to upgrade a weapon, I don't feel that really my weapons ever got stronger, or I found a selection of weapons that really had a significant impact on gameplay. On top of that, like, it's supposed to be twofold in that you can make environments feel more replayable, and also like incentivize players to use certain weapons, because there's this like day cycle, weather cycle for every time you go through an environment. It basically boosts or debuffs certain weapons and loadouts, but like everything is in this like 2% modifier range that it's completely irrelevant at the end of the day. So that just kind of felt like this basically like change of a set dressing that doesn't really do anything other than say like, here's the camp at night. Now here's the camp during the day. Here's the camp when it's raining, like that kind of thing, which doesn't really add anything, let alone like a new tactical challenge or way to kind of like overcome something that previously felt relatively insurmountable.
Yeah, especially when you've got it in tandem with like having you can basically add like negative connotations to your gameplay. Like there's toggles for that as well, which is, I don't know why you would in most cases. I think outside of some of the stuff we mentioned, it's like, well, this is useless, so I turn that off anyway and so get a bonus out of that. But again, it's just balance problems all round. Even like the upgrades, as you said, like the two sides of that, like you get too many for like the little, for your general abilities, but to actually unlock weapons and things like costs way more. Like, so it's like you need to go somewhere in the middle of this like that. But again, with such a dog shit start in terms of what you can have and do, like you don't really feel like you're making any progress. Just sort of, and you don't feel like you're any more powerful or doing anything different than you were when you started. Like one of the things I wanted very early on was like, an attack that like from that you jump and you dive down, and it's like, which I got, and then it was useless because it was slow. It didn't always work the way it's supposed to, and it just felt like, oh, well, there's very few times I'm going to use this, especially because I can't actually predict where it's going to land, and in certain places that's not going to help you. Yeah, it's just. I mean, we've covered early access stuff occasionally, but it does sometimes just feel like something that could have benefited from being in early access. But even then, I don't think it would really give many people motivation to say, "Oh, okay, so this is going to get better," sort of thing. But because it's a very poor way to start it like that.
Yeah,
I can't even say that it's entirely style over substance either, because that's inconsistent. And yeah, and like I said, down to the expectations of that side, that's where I think this game should have been strongest anyway. So that it just makes that more of a disappointment. And the rest of it, it's not the stuff they're normally doing, but they have done games in style and done it well. Like that, like I said with the missing is like it's great, and that's where they're doing like a 2.5D style game, and it's a much better game. It's more novel in terms of like things. It's still frustrating, very typical moments, but it's got an identity from start to finish, and it makes sense for that kind of thing as much as anything could make sense in a sweary one. But yeah, it's just very underwhelming for the things that should be strong at, and everything else is kind of expected, but in still disappointing.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable that this is an idea that's been cooking. I think they said initially it was announced in like 2019, and it feels like no real sort of like recon of the genre was done in that time. And it's like, again, this is a well-established blending of genres and subgenres. So the fact that so many aspects of this feel half-baked or underbaked, and I had read some reviews this morning when the embargo dropped, the morning of our recording, but a lot of people encountered performance issues, and I think I encountered probably lesser of them. I played on Xbox, and I found that there were a couple of instances of like notable frame rate dip, and that's when you have 4 or 5 phantoms on screen, especially when you're fighting a boss, and bosses take up 75% of the screen. And then you've got 5 phantoms and yourself, or 4 phantoms and yourself running around doing special attacks and all these things. And like to have performance dips during those quintessential moments that you've been building up to for an entire run, like it only happened to me about 3 or 4 times in my 7 hours or so. And each time was fucking more maddening than the last. On top of that, there were a couple of instances when I still had a black loading screen, but the game had actually loaded behind it. So by the time the black loading screen had dissipated, I was getting attacked by an enemy, and that completely fucked up a couple of runs that I had. So like there have been some instances like that for me that while I wouldn't say that they like marred the overall experience for me to the degree that some other people have experienced. It was definitely annoying, and to the degree that it was like in a game when, again, you can get dealt 70% of your health handed to you in the opening seconds, which happened a couple of times during the boss fight. Those types of moments, really, there's no excuse for them, and they cannot happen.
Yeah. No, yeah, I totally agree on that one.
I guess before we wrap out, like, how did you feel overall just about the boss fights? Because we've talked about, combat lacks a lot of oomph. Enemies outside of the boss fights are not very remarkable, but in terms of those, 6 or 7 like themed boss fights, how did you feel about their overall presentation, their level of challenge, and overall just like the design of them?
Design, great. General presentation is quite good. Like that. There's the idea behind each one, and like their themed moves and things like that. Yeah, that works. It's just the things underlying, kind of nullify some of that. So they're better challenges than anything else you play in the game. Let's put it that way. And they are like the reason to sort of get into it. But again, just the way that if you say do die and go straight back to the boss fight, it's like you get the intro to the cutscene again. It's like kind of just sours those special bits of it. Like to go in and do that again. And given they are like big bosses and they take up a lot of the screen, sometimes it's just like you're not seeing enough of it really matter. And it's like it doesn't really do what it's supposed to be doing with it. And the movesets, whilst like very well themed, like there's a couple of things where you're like, that's cheap, like that, and especially the sort of moves that like juggle you and knock you back, and you can't do anything about it until you unlock stuff later. That kind of helps in that. Yeah, I mean, it's probably the strongest examples you have in the game of like challenge and like a rhyme and a rhythm, like to the personality to a character that is an adversary.
Yeah, I think that for me, it's not until about the third zone, I think, where you unlock this passive ability that allows Justine to not take damage once she's been knocked over. And that should have been like the very first thing you unlock, because that was one of my huge points of frustration, especially with boss fights, which I think are actually a highlight of the game, which granted, as we've talked about, is not necessarily the biggest compliment you could give this game. But I think that overall, like the presentation, the design, the identity behind each of those bosses is really fantastic. It's more about, the mechanics that are fundamentally an issue within this game that stem throughout the experience that get in the way of that. And as I mentioned, my biggest instances of performance dips were during boss fights. On top of that, I get knocked down, like thinking about the second boss, which is basically like this like chicken leather face concoction that is like rolling around in a wheelchair, but it shoots fireballs at you, and then it's able to spin and does these sweeping sort of like airstrikes with its body. Getting knocked down by that and then having to do a second pass and taking more damage when I can't stand up is one of the most frustrating things I've experienced in a game, not only this year, but in the last few years. Cause it's one of those things where it's like, it feels like it's piling on the pain in a way that's very artificial at the end of the day. I'm all for, I need to memorize attack patterns. I need to have this level of reflexes, this and that. But like when I'm already down, to deal twice the amount of damage is pretty infuriating. I will say again, like the introduction of each of these bosses though is quite memorable, quite strong. The identity behind them, the fact that they could give us a Jason Voorhees type clone, and then this guy's obsessed with baseball and have like an attack pattern in a setting that really complements that sort of like theme. I don't have an issue with it at all. And I think that's great. I think the presentation there is smart, and it's building upon an already pretty steady foundation, as we said, of, wearing its influences on its sleeve, but giving it enough originality that it can kind of stand on its own. It's just a shame that this game, for whatever reason, lacks a level of polish that is to be expected if you're going to be making a game in this very well-established blending of genres and subgenres.
Yeah, I mean, I could understand a subversion from these two, especially that would be what I was looking for, and the subversion being it's like not as enjoyable as those games in that sort of genre that are really good. So yeah, that's not really the subversion we're going for. You can shitpost a game, but there's a limit to how much shitposting you can do with one.
I guess for me, like the biggest disappointment is that there's a lot of style, but not to the degree that you could label it as a game that's style over substance, because it feels like it wanes in both categories. Perhaps for me, like the gameplay is a much bigger detriment to the overall experience, but even for the brief inklings of moments where I'm like, oh, this game looks great, the presentation is strong, it's so few and far between those moments that you could barely say like, oh, this has a really great approach to that, because it's like, you don't get a lot of those instances. And I think also like one of the greatest strengths of this game is like the hotel and the intricate characters you're meeting and the eccentricities that they all have. And yet you don't get to interact with anybody, or the hotel for that matter, in much depth outside of, there's a monster living in the closet that lets you upgrade your abilities, and there's a lady in the lobby that lets you buy guns, or Lloyd the bartender is, willing to go on a spiel about his love of ears and how that's a currency in the game. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's weird, but there's not enough for us to really like chew on in this world. I think that's very fleeting in terms of the depth with which you can interact with this world. And if you're going to have a game where the gameplay itself doesn't really hold up for the course of the experience, like, you better facilitate some other aspects of that world in a way that's meaningful. And unfortunately, Hotel Barcelona doesn't really do that.
No, unfortunately not.
But unfortunately, one of the few instances, it seems, that a game that maybe on paper sounded like it'd be something that would be our bag, unfortunately didn't really come to fruition in that way. But, they can't all be winners, unfortunately. But I think at the end of the day, like, I'd much rather play something like this that takes a lot of swings, even if very few of them at the end of the day seem to connect as we would hope that they would.
Yeah, no home runs for Jacob. Yeah.
Even if he connected a lot with my fucking corpse because of that motherfucker launching projectiles like a motherfucker, which was infuriating. But that was a well put way to kind of round out our chat. But I guess at the end of the day, you want to see developers take swings. It's just, hope they connect a little bit more like our boy Jacob. But that's going to do it this week for our chat on Hotel Barcelona. And as always, my friend, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
I get you, man. Till next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.